You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-Jorge, and I am a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today is the first of a two-part episode with Professor Guy Jubb, Honorary Professor at the University of Edinburgh Business School. Guy is a Scottish chartered accountant who was previously an investment director at Standard Life Investments for over 30 years, until he retired in 2016 as Global Head of Governance and Stewardship. A corporate governance pioneer, Guy has worked on investor stewardship and ESG issues since the early 90s. Following his retirement, Guy remains active in this space. He is currently a director of the European Corporate Governance Institute and an independent non-executive at audit, tax and advisory firm Mazars LLP. Guy has served on a range of governance and business ethics committees, including here at the Conference Board, where he is currently co-chair of the European Corporate Governance Council. The views expressed by Guy on this podcast are his personal views and may or may not reflect the view of the organisations with which he is associated to or affiliated with. For the next two episodes, we'll be focusing on the G in ESG, governance. In this season, we've talked a lot about the E, environment, and S, social elements of sustainability, but we haven't touched much on the G yet. As legislation such as the European Sustainability Reporting Standards comes into play, companies will have to report much more transparently on governance issues, such as business ethics, payment practices, risk management, diversity, transparency, and, of course, greenwashing. And as companies continue to grapple with having sustainable business models, it is imperative to consider where governance issues slot into here. This is why I'm delighted to have someone with a huge depth of experience to discuss these issues with you today. Guy was one of the first people in the UK to have governance in his job title, when he started out in this field shortly after the Cadbury Committee report, which focused on the financial aspects of corporate governance and was published in 1992. Guy was also involved in developing the UK's first stewardship code, which concerns principles that institutional investors are expected to follow. The code aims to promote the responsible allocation, management, and oversight of capital to create long-term value for clients and beneficiaries, leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment, and society. With that in mind, I'd like to welcome you, Guy, to the podcast. I'm looking forward to chatting to you about all things corporate governance and stewardship with you today.
Barbara, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, and a good chat on governance is always a good thing.
Always a good thing and much needed in this time. So I'd like to start by asking you, as someone who's worked in corporate governance for many years and helped shape policy in this area, how have attitudes to corporate governance changed over the years?
Well, it has been a process as much as an event, and we have seen over the decades, we have moved from focus on total shareholder return and shareholder value. That was in the 1990s in particular, when everything was pointed at total shareholder value. Climate change, for example, was not really talked about very much in the 1990s in business circles. Then if we go into the 2000s, we moved much more into talking about enlightened shareholder value. This was something Tony Blair, the UK Prime Minister, brought back from a trip to Singapore. And it was actually provoking, and it provided a basis for changes to UK company law, but that had wider spread into the corporate governance ecosystem, not only in the UK, but also more broadly. And enlightened shareholder value sought to bring in a degree of societal value, a degree of social value into the corporate purpose, that we didn't really talk about corporate purpose in those days either. So fast forward to the 2010s, the last decade. Climate change in particular, and I come back to climate change, but also culture, I think it is important to bring into this. Climate change and culture were starting to gain in credibility. And it wasn't just convincing boards of this aspect, but it was also convincing investors. Investors, we're all creatures of our past, and including myself. We still hung on to, and with perhaps some credibility and understanding, the comfort blanket of shareholder value. But I think the tipping point was actually when we had the Paris Agreement in I think 2014, and that when there was hard targets brought in, the voice of the media, the voice of society, was putting business in the hot seat in terms of actually changing its behavior. So we are where we are today. And we're now at a state where, as you mentioned, we're talking about disclosure rules, international sustainability reporting standards waiting in the wings. Things have actually come a long way in the last decade, and we are on the cusp of probably a new era now in terms of governance and corporate reporting in this area.
It's good to finish on that positive note that we're in a new era and companies are they're gonna have to do more, because my next question to you was, how easy was it at the beginning to convince boards and investors to look beyond shareholder value? Did they look at you and think you were crazy, or what? Because you were operating in an era where these new codes were coming in, did people start to listen?
Well, the messaging points were coming from various sources, and perhaps not so much how easy, but actually how difficult was it in
Mm,
some cases, and much depended on the tone from the top, as it does in
of course.
many aspects of corporate governance. If And there's a bit of a generational factor here, Barbara, as I'm sure you appreciate, that tend by and large younger chairs, younger chief executives were ones who would embrace this with a more natural enthusiasm, whereas those of us who were older in the ecosystem probably took a little more persuasion in turn. But the influences came from regulators, which we will come back to, I'm sure, from
Yeah.
politicians, from society, and from individuals as well, making their views well heard. And companies came to recognize, boards came to recognize that not only was this something which they had an important role to play for bringing about change in society and change in behaviors consistent with the Paris Agreement, but also on the downside, there were reputational risks if they failed to do so and failed to do so with good grace. And so all these factors were impinging upon boards, and it has been a very good environment. But it has to be said that there are, and to be fair, many investors are there to serve their clients, investment managers. They're there to serve their clients. They're not there to serve politicians. They're not there to serve society as such. And pensions have to be paid. Savers are looking for a return on their savings. So whilst the climate and environmental and other aspects were integral to governance, nevertheless, there is still a financial imperative. And I think as we go forward, we have to learn how to balance this in terms of the way that we wish to be responsible.
I agree. And when, I work on advising companies on sustainability, and something that I always say, especially when talking about greenwashing, is companies can't pretend that one of their purposes is to make money. And that's why often things can sound so hollow. So that balance is absolutely crucial. I agree. It sounds like my next question was going to be, what are the barriers and opportunities remaining for companies today? But I think you already mentioned them, which is companies don't want to take a reputational hit, and legislation is influencing companies to think about more, disclose more. But is there anything else that's motivating
Well,
companies
perhaps I could just introduce into the conversation, Barbara, geographical
today?
boundaries. Because we are starting to see over the last 12 months the pushback on ESG in the
Mhm.
United States in particular. And bear in mind that's a big economy. Bear in mind there is the possibility of political change in the United States. And bear in mind their investors are some of the largest investors and we will come on to investors and the role of investors in global capital markets. But also, not just looking at the US, let's go over to the other side of the world, depending on where you're standing in the world, and go over to look at Asia and India. India is starting to do some good things, but nonetheless, coal, for example, is still a large part of their economy that has to be, and people are starting from different places. China is also, as we all know now, one of the largest economies, but the quality of information coming out of China is sometimes difficult to discern on some of these matters. So there are barriers or potential barriers, let me call them, to use a term that's in vogue, at least in the UK, potholes out there in terms of where things could go wrong. And in terms of the opportunities that are out there, if I could come therefore back to the board itself, and I'll come back to also this several times, I think, in our conversation today, the need to have directors who are trained and well versed in sustainability issues. If you ask a board of directors, a dozen directors each to write down their definition of sustainability, you will get a dozen different definitions coming back. You need to get some consistency. You need in a board to have the sustainability integrated into your conversations. You may not always use the word sustainability, it's the components of sustainability, but nobody needs to be afraid to raise them, but everybody should have at least a level of competence to engage in the conversation and do so in an informed way.
Great, thank you. So, alongside corporate governance, we've already mentioned the term stewardship in relation to the UK stewardship code that you worked on. It's a very interesting term. So I'd like to ask you, how would you define it and how do you feel it relates to governance and more generally sustainability?
Yeah, I love the word stewardship. It's a tonal word. Sustainability is nice, don't get me wrong, but stewardship has a certain quality to it, which is subtly but significantly different. And for me, stewardship is about behavior, and it's about behaving in a way that enables you to look after and cherish the assets which are entrusted to you in a way that you can pass them on to future generations, to future stewards, in a way that the value of those assets has been nurtured and enhanced for the long term, and in long term is an important component of stewardship, incidentally, has been nurtured, but also such that the assets are in good order and are well set out in a package. So stewardship is tonal. Stewardship is something to we talk about it, stewardship code for investors. Stewardship is not just for investors. Stewardship should be also in the boardroom conversations that are taking place. It shouldn't be too compartmentalized, and it should be embedded in the governance, but also the culture of the company. The board, through the chief executive, is ultimately responsible for culture, and so that cannot be ignored. But the one thing that is difficult with stewardship, and this is where sustainability as a term probably does have an advantage, there are components of sustainability that can be measured.
Mm-hmm.
I talked
Carbon
about
emissions.
the value of assets.
Yeah.
With stewardship, because of its tonality, because of its behavioral aspects, it is much more difficult to measure. But I think we all know good stewardship when we see it, and we all know bad stewardship when we encounter it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention future generations. And you also mentioned before about if you interview a board of directors, every one of them is going to give a different definition of sustainability, because that is often how I start workshops that I do on greenwashing and sustainability. And you do get different answers. But what I find interesting is that more and more in recent years, people do think about future generations, the cliche of leaving a better planet for your children and your grandchildren. And I feel like in 2010, when I first started working in sustainability, this wasn't considered as much. So yeah, I'm really happy that you've
Yeah, no,
um,
I recognize very much what you say there.
mhm.
And if I could just add one thing here, and this was something I've just read actually this morning. My good friend Mark Goyder, who was the founder of Tomorrow's Company, a thought leadership company based in the UK, he has made the point. We have had a lot of issues in the UK with water companies.
Yes.
Maybe the same in Europe, but with Thames Water being the main culprit in this, in terms of sewage going into the to lakes, rivers, but also supplies not being good, the cost going up to consumers, and most recently the financial implications coming through. And the point that Mark was making is that regulators should also have stewardship obligations. And I think that's a very pertinent idea. In Scotland, where I live, we have Scottish Water, which is still owned by the government, and we can talk also about how different ownership patterns may come into play. I enjoy
Yes.
Scottish Water.
I have not lived in the UK since 2013, yet I still follow the news and I do know what is going on with Thames Water. So, yes, thank you for sharing. And if you're not aware, listeners, look it up because it's a very interesting conversation on stewardship, ethics, and many other areas.
And governance.
You, I think you answered my related questions to stewardship, guys. So I'm going to move to the next section. Um, so in the introduction, I mentioned a range of governance related issues that companies will have to increasingly consider, not only for their business model, but in terms of reporting requirements. And as you say, we're going to come back to talking about legislation and sustainability reporting standards in more depth in part two. But I want to pick on two topics in this section. So, firstly, compensation and remuneration. So, that's increasingly at the forefront of companies' minds. And for example, in some countries, companies are having to report gender pay gaps much more transparently than ever, as an
Mm.
example. So, I would like to know, how have you seen conversations relating to payment practices evolve over the last few years, and what should companies be prioritizing in this area?
Yeah. Um, in terms of the evolution of conversation, to a certain extent, things haven't changed significantly because the conversation, I'll come back to what has actually happened in practice, but the conversations themselves have tended to take place between asset managers and not so much asset owners, but increasingly asset owners. The distinction here being asset managers being the investment managers who manage uh, funds for pension fund trustees and are looking to make a profit out of their managing those assets, whereas asset owners are people like pension fund trustees who are wanting to ensure that values are maintained and are looking to ensure that their beneficiaries get the requisite financial benefits. So the point here I'm coming to is that although there are regular conversations between companies and shareholders and investors about compensation, the nature of those conversations has changed significantly and subtly. There has been more input coming in from asset owners than was the case in the past. Asset owners were tended to be slightly asleep at the wheel, many of them in this. They are now energized to some degree in this conversation, but also the introduction of sustainability metrics into the performance related pay has progressively come along. Now, I mentioned the sort of timeline when we were talking about enlightened shareholder value and into the early part of the 2010s, we did see sustainability metrics coming into play, particularly for companies like oil companies, mining companies, extraction companies, also for some people companies. But they were usually 5 to 10% of the total long term. And also, coming back to measurement, they were regarded as soft measures that couldn't be measured. Where we are going and have come now is that we are seeing much more well-articulated targets being put into compensation plans. The proportion has increased. Generally speaking, it is less than the financial component, but the proportion has been increased to make it actually more meaningful in terms of the behavior of the chief executive. And lastly, because I have been rabbiting on for some time now about this, to, to say that the conversations too, I think, are starting to not only focus on the chief executive's pay, but also, importantly, how those in the C-suite and below, how the sustainability metrics are cascaded down into the organization, because it's not just about the chief executive. Sustainability is a team effort, and team sustainability want to be incentivized, but also rewarded, celebrating success for actually getting good outcomes, and to also significantly recognizing where there have been slippages in achieving targets or whatsoever, and doing a little bit of reflection around that in terms of good management and good governance to understand the basis for that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think many people don't think about these topics, especially when it comes to sustainability, and it is absolutely it cuts across lots of
Well,
different elements of sustainability.
yeah, 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 and it's when people look back at incentives and how they are used, and I think as we are speaking at the moment, there is a move to move UK and European compensation packages in the boardroom to US style packages. These things become more critical in terms of as the incentives increase uh, to the way that behavior uh, changes is something that has to be watched very carefully by independent non-executives to make sure that the balance and checks and balances remain in place.
Great, thank you. To finish up this part, I'd like to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which we've already touched upon in this episode: greenwashing. So obviously, this has been mentioned throughout this season, and we've talked about it more in terms of the E and the S. And while it may be easy for people to see why a company that says it's climate friendly or people oriented might be stretching the truth, especially when it comes to issues in the supply chain, do you see greenwashing being an issue when it comes to talking about governance? And if so, in which areas?
Oh, absolutely, Barbara.
Mm.
Um, the greenwashing in terms of as the input, for example, let me put it that way, looking at particularly on where your business is facing is a consumer facing business. Um, Greenwashing can be damaging, not only in terms of the uh, fundamental of making false representations and the culture that goes with that, but it can have a significant impact upon how consumers respond to your product once the media, social media in particular, gets a hold of it. Going back to the earlier days of greenwashing, not sure we called it greenwashing in those days, was the Volkswagen scandal, the
Mhm.
diesel emissions, and how that uh, just gathered momentum over 1 or 2 years, what seemed like something in terms of a small misrepresent, small, I use in parenthesis, misrepresentation to consumers, actually became something that got into the heart of governance. Chief executives went, other people went, and it really did damage the Volkswagen brand. The fact that we're talking about it and talking about it now means
Mhm.
it's still in memory. And it's so these reputational risks run hard. The reporting that is going to go about around, particularly in Europe, around the issues around greenwashing, around sustainability, um, The board is in a very difficult position in some of these regards because there's an asymmetry of information. Some of the detailed information that is being required by uh, by by the new standards are something that board members will not of themselves be able to get their heads around and say, yes, that's the right number, or no, that's
Hmm.
the wrong number. So they have to rely on others to do the job. This has been a field day for consultants in terms of the opportunities to advise companies and the channels of communication to inform board directors is something which is evolving, and I think we will see more evolution coming over the next few years.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I just wanted to say also, we haven't talked about whistleblowing
Hmm.
and the importance of whistleblowing and speaking up processes. And non-executives do have a key role to play in making sure that these processes are well oiled, that people who are in the organization or even outside of the organization can speak up confident that they can do so in confidence, confident that their backs are covered in the event that questions are raised. And whistleblowing, particularly in the area of sustainability, particularly as compensation becomes more focused on sustainability, is one of the very, very important parts of corporate governance oversight that boards have to be on top of.
Absolutely. Thank you, Guy, for joining us today. This is the first of a two-part episode, so join us next time for part two. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.